And it's been a quiet week in Storrs, Connecticut, my hometown, out on the edge of the campus. The people of Storrs continue to experience a gradually increasing euphoria as the weather becomes consistently warmer. Even those days with slightly lower temperatures hardly affect the moods of a community of people who can now look at their weather apps and see more than a week's worth of temperatures in the 70s ahead of them, just as they saw about a week's worth of temperatures in the 60s ahead of them a few weeks ago. Of course, there are always a few people here in Storrs who wish the temperatures would remain in the 60s, much like the music here on Just Another Wavelength sometimes does. But the other day I was in Storrs Center, that sensation-tastical downtown area which really should have been called the Storrs of Storrs. And I decided to walk into the Dog Lane Cafe, so I came in and I sat down and I stayed at the table for a while as I tried to make up my mind what to order. And as I sat there trying to decide between a strawberry and cantaloupe daiquiri and a raspberry and watermelon cocktail, I couldn't help overhearing a passionate conversation at a nearby table among a group of people who seemed to be taking an entirely different issue with the atmospheric conditions. It started when one guy glanced down at his phone and noticed the date and exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's almost May 1st. And his friend said, "I can't believe it. It seems like just the other day this year was just getting started, and now before we know it, we're a third of the way through it already." And a young woman who was at the table with them, presumably the girlfriend of one or both of them, jumped in with, "We've got to do something about this. It's almost May 1st. The year is slipping away from us. We've got to send out a signal of distress." And all three of them held up their hands and waved them around as if in imminent danger while yelling, "Mayday!" And it reminded me of the spring of 1969, back when I was a student at UConn. Spring was always a phenomenon at UConn back then. Of course, there were varying degrees of spring, much like there are now, and we students are all well aware of it as we waited out the intermediate period of time between the day our surroundings started looking like spring and the day the temperatures started feeling like spring. But there was always a day sometime during that period when several students would wake up simultaneously and stick their heads out the window and officially declare that spring had arrived. And when I say officially, I mean loudly enough to wake up their roommates. Of course, for many students, the highlight of spring was spring weekend, a tradition that seems to have always existed but has meant a variety of different things over the years. Before the spring of 1969, spring weekend meant that students from across the university would come together and parade down the streets on stilts, but the university administration quickly put an end to this gesture, thinking it was just a bit too stilted. So the first spring weekend I experienced was very different, and in fact I really didn't experience it, seeing as I was in my dorm being productive for most of the weekend, so I don't actually know how it was different. Anyway, since I'm performing this monologue the week after spring weekend of 2015, I'm not actually going to focus this part of my monologue on spring weekend of the spring of 1969, back when I was a student at UConn. Instead, I'll tell you about something that happened the following week during that intermediate period between spring weekend and finals, otherwise known as the last week of classes. So, on the Thursday of my last week of classes that semester, a day on which I did not actually have any classes due to the idiosyncrasies of my schedule, I was walking along the path by Mirror Lake that afternoon when I passed by a couple of seniors sitting on a bench, and they had just had their last classes of their college career, and they were reflecting on their 4 years of classes, and one of them said to the other, "Honestly, Jack, I can't remember any specific classes I took. They all seem the same as I look back. They all tend to blur together." And Jack replied, "I feel you, Gary. I'm so proud to live in a society where there are hardly any class distinctions." Of course, these days everyone seems to love the classes at UConn, even non-UConn students. I was walking by Mirror Lake the other day, and I noticed a biology professor standing in front of a group of students, apparently teaching an outdoor class, and he had written lecture notes on the backs of his hands, probably because there was a moderate breeze that day, and he didn't want to rely on handwritten or typed notes lest they blow away. Of course, I hope he hadn't been planning on giving the class a quiz that day, because if he had brought an answer key, he might have lost it as well, and then the answers would be blowing in the wind. But anyway, as he stood there talking to his class, glancing every few seconds at the notes he had written on the backs of his hands, a pedestrian who was walking by at about the same time I was called out, "Hey, Mr. Biology Professor, are you sure you know enough about your field to be teaching a class outdoors by a lake?" And the professor smiled at the pedestrian and replied, "Oh, trust me, I know the field of biology like the back of my hand." And that's the news from Storrs, Connecticut, where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the incoming and outgoing directors of Jewish college organizations are above average. You're listening to WHUS2. This is Just Another Wavelength. I actually wrote that within the last 4 or 5 hours, so if some of my phrasing was unclear, that's why. I mean, there were a couple of places where I found things I'm actually going to have to go back and change because I used the different wording that I meant to, or some sort of grammatical error or something like that. So if I'm going to archive all these news from Storrs scripts, I'll want to change that so I don't confuse all of you. And I hope I didn't yell so loudly on that Mayday pun that it obscured the meaning of the pun. I hope you found that as amusing as I hope you did. But that goes without saying, if you think about it.